The Admiral laughed. The room followed. "What's your call sign, hero?" He smirked, pointing at the quiet man in the back of the hangar. But when the weathered boat mechanic finally replied, two words stopped every breath in the room. Iron Ghost. Within seconds, the Admiral's face drained of color. Veterans stood straighter. Officers exchanged looks. Because suddenly, they knew exactly who they were mocking. This wasn't just a chaperone. He was the man who'd vanished after Damascus, the ghost the Pentagon buried. And now, in front of his daughter, and the men who failed him, he was done hiding. Where are you watching from today? If this story touched your heart, drop your city in the comments, and tap subscribe to honor these quiet heroes. The smell of salt, pine, and engine grease lingered in the winter air as Thomas Everett tightened the last bolt on the Callahan boat. Snow flurries dusted the dock behind him, melting on contact with the warm hull. He'd been at the boatyard since before dawn, just as he had for the past 7 years. Quiet mornings, mechanical routine, no surprises. That's how he liked it. He didn't notice Lana until she was beside him, holding out a mug of coffee with both hands like a peace offering. Her coat was zipped too high, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. 16, sharp-eyed cello case always slung too heavy on her back. She looked like her mother in the way that made Thorne's chest ache. "You left early again," she said. "Old habits," he replied, accepting the mug. His fingers, rough and scarred, dwarfed the ceramic. She didn't sit, just leaned her shoulder against a piling. "We've got a field trip next week. Orchestra thing. They want us to perform at the base. Some SEAL ceremony or whatever." Thorne stilled. His eyes flicked toward the Navy ships in the harbor, barely visible through the morning fog. He didn't answer right away. "They say if we make a good impression, the school might get funding," she added, watching him closely. "Arts programs on the chopping block." He reached for the wrench again, fiddling with a clamp that was already perfect. "You need me to sign something?" She handed him the folded form. His hand hovered a moment before taking it, like it might burn. He read it once, slowly, then signed with crisp, precise strokes. Military strokes. "They need parent chaperones," she said. "I've got boats to fix." "You avoid anything to do with the Navy," she said. "You duck out of Memorial Day. You turn the other way when Commander Adler walks by in town." "I've got no issue with Adler," he muttered. "Then why do you hide when you see him?" He didn't answer, just handed the slip back and adjusted a clamp that didn't need adjusting. Lana didn't push. She'd grown up knowing the difference between silence and avoidance. "I've got rehearsal after school," she said, stepping away. "Don't wait up. I'll leave dinner in the oven," he said. She nodded and left, and only after her footsteps faded did Thorne stop working. He looked across the water toward the base, his jaw tight. Snow gathered on the edges of his worn boots. That night, after Lana went to bed, he pulled down the metal box from the highest shelf in his closet. He didn't open it, just stared. Dust covered its lid like a warning, "Do not disturb." But something had shifted today, something that wouldn't unshift. He set it on the bed, sat beside it, didn't move for a long time. Sleep came late and badly. In his dream, the heat was blistering and the radio screamed orders he ignored. Sand, blood, children's eyes wide with terror, and the sound, God, that sound, when the RPG hit. He woke before dawn, heart racing. Old training helped him slow his breathing. Center, reset. By the time Lana came into the kitchen, he had eggs on the stove and toast warming in the oven. She froze in the doorway, surprised. "You okay?" she asked cautiously. "Fine," he said, sliding a plate toward her. "Eat, we'll be late." "Late for what?" "School," he said simply. "I need to talk to Principal Finch about chaperoning that field trip." She blinked. "You're coming?" He nodded once, eyes on the pan. "You asked." The bus rolled past the last security checkpoint, its windows flashing with reflections of steel and sunlight. Lana leaned forward, violin case between her knees, eyes wide as the naval base opened around them like a forgotten world. Beside her, Thorne sat still, civilian clothes, weathered jacket, but his posture, straight, alert, made the military escorts shift unconsciously in their seats. One looked back at him twice, said nothing. Hangar 4 came into view, its massive doors thrown open like a stage curtain. Inside, flags draped from rafters, folding chairs in perfect rows. a raised platform adorned with polished metal and navy blue. Photographs lined the walls, sanitized glimpses of missions, faces half shadowed by medals and coded names. The students began unloading. Lana stayed close to her father, sensing the shift in his breathing. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded once. "Stay with your section. Don't let anyone pull you off course." "Dad, it's a concert, not combat." He didn't answer, just scanned the area, corners, exits, security posts, with eyes that missed nothing. Inside, they were assigned a spot near the rear, opposite the refreshment tables. Adresha handed out programs. "Solo is third. Warm up quiet. We're being watched." Lana smiled. "You mean admired?" Adresha gave her a look. "I mean watched." On the far side of the hangar, Admiral Riker Blackwood entered. His uniform looked like it weighed 20 pounds. Ribbons, stars, polished metal. His walk was deliberate, practiced for rooms like this. He smiled like a man who'd never lost control of anything. Thorne's gaze locked on him. He didn't blink. Blackwood hadn't seen him yet. He moved through the crowd like a political candidate. One handshake too many, one laugh too loud. Photographers followed. Aides whispered. Reporters hovered at the edge, waiting for approved sound bites. When Blackwood took the stage, the room quieted. "Distinguished guests, honored veterans, ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth as glass. "Today we recognize the extraordinary valor of our naval special warfare operators." Polite applause. Over the past decade, these elite teams have conducted operations that shaped global security, often in silence, always in sacrifice. He clicked through a few curated slides. Operation names floated on screens. Kingfisher, Black Anvil, and then Damascus, Blackwood said, pausing. The word hit Thorne like a cold wind. Lana turned slightly. His hands were clenched at his sides. Blackwood's tone shifted to something somber, rehearsed. 10 years ago, under my command, brave men undertook a high-risk extraction in Damascus. The mission was ultimately successful, but not without cost. There was silence. Thorne didn't move. He didn't breathe. "I have always taken responsibility," Blackwood continued, "and I honor those who carried out my orders with courage." In the second row, a lean officer in his 40s turned his head. Commander Sable. His eyes scanned the crowd, paused on Thorne, didn't look away. Around the hangar, a ripple passed, unspoken recognition, small things. A soldier straightening his posture, a Navy pilot frowning slightly, a woman in a black suit whispering to someone, glancing toward the back. They didn't know him, not exactly, but something in the way Thorne stood, hands at his sides, back straight, told them this was no parent chaperone. Blackwood wrapped up his speech, gesturing toward the students. "Today, we're also honored by the young musicians from West Haven High, a tribute, through music, to our fallen and our living." And the students assembled. Lana took her place, bow ready, fingers trembling. Or her eyes found Thorne. He didn't smile, but his presence alone steadied her. The orchestra began, a swell of strings, crisp woodwinds, tension released into melody. When Lana's solo came, Samuel Barber's adagio, the room changed. Notes floated upward like prayers, clean, aching, familiar. Across the hangar, Admiral Blackwood turned. His smile faltered. He stared at the girl, then past her. Then he saw Thorne. The recognition wasn't instant. It happened in layers. First, the frown, then the hesitation, then the sharp breath and the paling face. Blackwood stiffened, and across the floor, Commander Sable took one step forward. Lana played through the final note, then silence. Long, respectful, heavy. Thunderous applause followed. The orchestra stepped down, refreshments resumed, and Blackwood made his move. He crossed the room casually, approaching the students with a politician's charm. "Beautiful playing," he said to Lana. "You have a gift." "Thank you, sir," she said. Thorne stepped into frame. Blackwood noticed, stared. "You the music director?" he asked, too casually. "Her father?" "You carry yourself like military," Blackwood said. Something shifted behind his eyes. Thorne didn't reply. "What unit?" the Admiral pressed. "Does it matter?" "Professional curiosity. I've commanded many." People around them slowed, listening. "You don't wear any pins," Blackwood said louder. "No unit tags, no identifiers. Don't need them." "Well," Blackwood said, spreading his hands, "let's ask the question plainly then. He smiled at the crowd now, forming around them. "What's your call sign, hero?" Thorn didn't move, didn't flinch, but the temperature dropped. Lana looked up at him. He met Blackwood's gaze, and for the first time in 10 years, spoke words that turned the air electric. "You know, Admiral," he said softly, "Damascus wasn't quite as you described it." The air in the hangar changed. What had been polite noise became strained silence. Blackwood's smile didn't falter, but something behind his eyes sharpened, measured, defensive. "And what would you know?" he asked, his voice just loud enough to carry. "About Damascus?" The words held weight, but Thorn's stillness held more. His gaze didn't waver, his posture hadn't shifted, but somehow he stood taller now, as though he no longer needed to hide. "I know the exact sound a Russian RPG makes when it lands 3 clicks off target," Thorn said quietly. "I know how fear tastes when it mixes with blood and sand. I know what it means to carry your teammate's body through a kill zone because there's no one else left." Gasps broke out. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just breath, involuntarily sucked in by those who recognized the cadence. The language of men who had lived through things others couldn't name. Blackwood's smile faltered. Commander Sable took another step forward, slow and deliberate. Thorn's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You stood behind a command post screen. I stood in a basement with children clinging to me, praying I wouldn't leave them behind." Lana's breath caught. She looked up at her father, not the quiet man fixing boats in a wind-worn jacket, but someone she didn't recognize, someone terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. Blackwood's voice cracked the silence. "Who exactly do you think you are?" Thorn paused, as if the answer required careful thought. Then his eyes flicked to Lana, and a soft apology passed across his face. Not regret, but grief that she had to hear what came next. He turned back to the Admiral. "Iron Ghost!" The name cut the room in half. Someone dropped a glass. It shattered, and no one moved to clean it. A woman in uniform exhaled audibly. An older man in the second row whispered, "Jesus Christ!" Blackwood went still, paler by the second. His voice was gone. The silence swelled, not of reverence, but of reckoning. Sable's expression had shifted entirely, recognition dawning like sunlight on ice. One by one, veterans in the room stood taller, instinctively straightening their backs. Active duty SEALs exchanged looks. One stepped back as though instinct told him this man outranks the silence. "Iron Ghost was a myth," someone said under their breath. But Thorn was still there, solid, breathing, unapologetic. "You disappeared," Blackwood finally managed. "You vanished off every grid." "That was the deal," Thorn replied simply. Lana looked at him like she'd never seen him before, because she hadn't. A civilian life, a girl raised by a man who mended boats and avoided parades. And now, this. Her father, the shadow story whispered in locker rooms and mission briefings. Blackwood looked around, finding less support by the second. He raised his voice, trying to reclaim the floor. "None of this proves anything. You have no record, no insignia, no—" Thorn reached into his pocket slowly. His movement made half the room tense, expecting danger. Instead, he pulled out a small metal coin, its edges worn but unmistakable. He held it up. It caught the light. "Damascus Mint," he said, "given to me by the father of the children we saved, after you ordered us to abort." He turned, flipping the coin gently toward Sable, who caught it without flinching. The commander studied it. His face changed. "This matches the debrief description," Sable said, voice heavy with something nearing awe. "October 17th, Thorn continued, eyes still on Blackwood. "Safe house compromised. You ordered us out from Qatar. We stayed." Blackwood's mouth opened, but nothing came out. "You gambled. You knew the risk, the leak. You sent us anyway." Now murmurs swept the room. Words like court-martial, classified, and cover-up passed between officers and veterans like live wires. From the edge of the gathering, Adrija moved closer, quietly placing a hand on Lana's shoulder. The girl didn't flinch. Her eyes never left her father. 3 men had died that night. Men Thorn had carried in silence for 10 years, their names written wrong in official ledgers. "You disobeyed orders," Blackwood said, trying for one last attack. Thorn nodded. "And saved 4 lives, 3 of them children. And buried your career." I had a 1-year-old daughter who had just lost her mother, his voice dropped. I didn't need a career. I needed to disappear. Sable took another step forward, the coin still in his hand. That's why the files were sealed, he murmured. Iron Ghost isn't a nickname, another SEAL muttered. It's a warning label. Blackwood's voice was thin now. None of this is admissible. No formal statement. Thorne stepped forward. I didn't come to make statements. He turned, nodding toward Lana. I came for her. And in that moment, the crowd turned. Not in judgment, but in recognition. Men who had worn uniforms with pride understood the weight of silence, understood the choice between duty and family. Sable stood straighter. Then, without a word, he raised his hand in a crisp salute. One by one, others followed. Veterans, active duty. Then civilians who understood enough to know what it meant. The Admiral was left surrounded by salutes not meant for him. And Thorne? Thorne returned it, with the precision of a man who had never forgotten. Lana sat in stunned silence as her father lowered his hand. The salutes still hung in the air, slowly falling one by one like fading echoes. Around them, the crowd had shifted, some whispering, others just staring, the unspoken weight of realization anchoring the room. Blackwood's expression was unreadable, but his jaw worked furiously. You vanished for a reason, Merrick, he said, his voice brittle. Maybe you should have stayed gone. Before Thorne could reply, Commander Sable stepped forward, sharp and deliberate. Without hesitation, he offered the Damascus coin back to Thorne. Your team saved those children, Sable said, his tone formal but layered with respect. History should know that. Thorne accepted the coin without a word, his fingers curled around it, not with possession, but protection, as if the truth it held needed guarding. Lana's voice broke the silence, soft, shaken. Dad? He turned slowly. What's going on? Before he could answer, Sable's voice cut in. Admiral Blackwood, he said, gaze steady. I'll need to speak with you, privately. The Admiral's face tightened. This is neither the time nor the place. It is now, Sable replied. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Behind them, murmurs spread like wind over water, the name Iron Ghost, the word Damascus. Men began pulling out phones. A few stepped away, making quiet calls. The atmosphere of controlled ceremony had evaporated. In its place, tension, gravity, and the sense that something long buried had just been unearthed. Thorne looked at Lana again. She was staring at him like he was someone new, not angry, just lost. Adrisha touched her shoulder, guiding her a step back as a wall of uniformed officers began moving. They didn't swarm, they shifted, realigned, and suddenly, Blackwood wasn't the center of the room anymore. Sable gestured toward a side corridor. Sir. With visible effort, Blackwood composed himself and turned sharply, walking toward the exit with his spine stiff as steel. The ceremony didn't end, it unraveled. Thorne remained still, but Lana stepped closer. You lied to me, she said. Not accusation, just a truth released at last. I didn't lie, he said quietly. I just didn't tell you. That's the same thing. He looked down, the weight of her gaze heavier than any medal he'd ever received. I needed to keep you safe, he said. From what? Her voice was rising now. From knowing who you really are? From the fact that people salute you and call you Iron Ghost? But I didn't even know your name wasn't Merrick. Thorne inhaled, held it. It is now, he said. It's the name I took when I left, your mother's name. I chose it so I could become someone else. Lana's face shifted. Mom knew? He nodded. She was intelligence. She helped me disappear. We agreed. If anything ever went wrong, I'd take you and vanish. And Damascus? She asked. What happened there? He hesitated. Before he could answer, Adrisha stepped in gently. Maybe not here, she said softly, glancing at the gathering crowd. There are too many ears. Thorne nodded. We'll go home. Not yet, came a new voice. Commander Sable had returned, his face shadowed with something grim. Blackwood's claiming you made threats. He's requesting a formal review of the Damascus file. Thorne didn't react. Let him. It means this isn't over, Sable said. They'll come. Investigators, maybe NCIS. You've been off the map for 10 years. You just stepped into the center of one of the most controversial sealed ops in naval history. Didn't mean to, Thorne said. But I won't walk away. Sable looked at Lana, then back at Thorne. Do you want protection? No, Thorne said. Just time. You'll have it, Sable said. But not much. He turned to leave, then paused. They'll contact you soon, probably in person. When he was gone, Lana stood facing her father, arms crossed tight against her chest. You're not just some guy who fixes boats. No, Thorne said, but that's the man I tried to become. For you. She blinked hard. And now what? Now, he said, we go home, and I'll tell you everything I can. As they moved toward the exit, space opened for them, not out of fear, but recognition. Officers stepped aside. Parents lowered their voices. Students from Lana's school stared in quiet awe. Outside, the wind had picked up. The flags along the base perimeter flapped sharply, crisp against the pale sky. They walked in silence. No one stopped them. In the truck, Lana stared out the window. The cello sat in the back seat, her hands clenched in her lap. You should have told me, she said finally. I know. Are you in trouble? I don't know yet. They drove in silence. By the time they reached West Haven, dusk was falling. Lights blinked on across the harbor, familiar, quiet. A place that had never known the weight of a name like Iron Ghost. Thorne parked the truck in front of the house. Lana didn't move. What happens now? She asked. He looked ahead. Now we wait. Thorne didn't expect them so soon. By mid-morning the next day, 3 black SUVs turned slowly into the gravel lot of the boatyard. Their plates bore the unmistakable code of federal clearance. He set down the wrench, wiped his hands on an oil rag, and watched them pull to a stop. The first door opened. Commander Sable stepped out. Behind him came 2 men in suits, one with the stiff posture of military law, the other carrying a slim briefcase and quiet authority. Mr. Merrick, Sable said. Formal now. This is Agent Kavanaugh from NCIS and Special Investigator Durand with the Inspector General's office. Thorne nodded. Coffee's on, inside's quieter. The office smelled of salt and grease, but the table was clean. Kavanaugh declined coffee. Durand sat and opened a notepad with crisp precision. We're conducting a preliminary inquiry into Operation Damascus, Kavanaugh began. Your comments yesterday contradict the official record. I didn't make a statement, Thorne said. I answered a question. Durand leaned forward. Nevertheless, your words carry weight, especially given the ripple effect. Admiral Blackwood has filed a complaint, accusations of defamation and unauthorized disclosure. Thorne said nothing. We're here to clarify the record, Sable said, not prosecute. For now, Kavanaugh added. Durand opened a file. We'd like your account, from the briefing to the extraction and the orders in between. Thorne studied them both. What happens to my daughter if I cooperate? Nothing changes for her, Durand said. You're not on trial. This is about what happened over there, and why the reports don't match. Thorne nodded once, then began. He spoke with clinical clarity. The initial briefing, the insertion under nightfall, the failed safe house, the voice over radio ordering abort, and his refusal. Kavanaugh took notes. Durand listened, eyes narrowing when Thorne described the waiting ambush. Enemy fighters already set up at the supposed extraction point. No search pattern, no confusion. They knew where we'd be. You think it was leaked, Kavanaugh said. I know it was. And who had access to the coordinates? Only the command post in Qatar and my team. Durand's pen paused. Blackwood? Thorne's jaw flexed. He gave the order. Before the conversation could continue, the door creaked open. Lana stepped in, backpack over her shoulder. Her eyes widened when she saw the suits. Sorry, it's fine, Thorne said gently. Come in. She glanced between them, then moved quietly to stand beside the workbench. Durand followed her with his eyes. You're the reason he disappeared, he said, almost to himself. Thorne met his gaze. She's the reason I came back. They wrapped up an hour later. Durand promised follow-ups. Sable handed over a card. If anyone approaches you, call me first. When the vehicles finally pulled away, Lana stood at the window, arms crossed. "You okay?" Thorne asked. "No," she said honestly. "You said some ghosts don't stay buried. Looks like they're digging them up now." Thorne leaned against the doorframe. "It was bound to happen." "Will they charge you for going against orders?" He shook his head. "Maybe once, not anymore. Now it's about what they covered up." Lana stared at him. Was it always like that? Orders that didn't make sense? People in command playing games with lives? "Not always," he said, "but once is enough." She hesitated. "Did you lose people in Damascus?" He nodded. 3 brothers. "And the coin? The one you showed at the ceremony?" "Gift from the children we saved, their father." "Do they know that you're alive?" Thorne's face shifted. "They think I died. That was the point." That evening, the boatyard fell quiet again. But the silence didn't last. At dusk, Lana returned from school with a cello slung over one shoulder and news on her lips. The naval base called Principal Finch. They're offering full funding for the music program. Thorne raised a brow. "That's fast." "Word's out," she said. "Even if nothing's official, people saw what happened. They saw him back down." Thorne returned to sanding the side panel of the Callahan boat. "It's not over." "I know," Lana said, then softer. "But it feels different now, like you're not hiding anymore." Thorne said nothing, just kept working. As the sun dipped, they moved back inside. Dinner was quiet. The rhythm between them had shifted, still familiar, but edged with something new. Lana wasn't just looking at him as a father. She was searching for the parts he hadn't shown her before. And then came the knock. 3 short raps on the workshop's side door. Thorne froze. He looked out the window. 3 men stood outside, military bearing, still, precise. One walked with a slight limp. Another held something wrapped in a flag. "Dad?" Lana asked. He didn't answer. She followed his gaze. Her voice softened. "You know them?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "I did." He opened the door. The first man stepped forward, removing his cap. "Been a long time, Ghost." Thorne stared, disbelief flickering across his face. "Weston," he said, "they told me you were dead." "Close enough. Spent 8 months in Walter Reed." The second man raised the folded flag. "For Riley. His family asked us to find you, said this belonged to you now." Thorne's face tightened. The third man stood back, watching carefully. "Archer," he introduced himself. "I replaced Kramer after Damascus. Heard stories. Never thought I'd meet you." Behind them, Lana hovered, still, speechless. Thorne gestured them in. As they entered, the years peeled back. Not with words, but with the weight they carried. Ghosts didn't stay dead. They came to finish what hadn't been buried right. The ceremony was held in a secure wing of the Pentagon. No cameras, no press, just flags, folded chairs, and the weight of a truth long buried. Thorne stood at the back of the room, in a charcoal suit. He hadn't worn one in years. Lana sat beside him, cello case at her feet. Her fingers fidgeted with the zipper, but her expression was calm. The Secretary of the Navy opened the ceremony. "Today we correct the record," he said, voice firm, "and we honor the men who made the impossible decision to stay behind, to save lives, and to carry each other home." As names were read, Staff Sergeant Seth Riley, Chief Petty Officer James Donovan, Specialist Michael Kramer, their families stepped forward to receive Navy crosses. Tears flowed freely. Thorne's hands curled tight at his sides, the names echoing like a drumbeat in his chest. Commander Sable took the podium next. "And we recognize Master Sergeant Thomas Everett, call sign Iron Ghost, a man who chose principle over protocol, who carried wounded men through fire, and vanished to protect a daughter and the truth." Thorne moved to the front slowly. The secretary handed him a case, the Navy Cross gleaming inside. "Your country thanks you, Sergeant. The record has been corrected." Thorne accepted it with steady hands. "They died heroes," he said simply. "That's all that should ever have mattered." He returned to his seat, but not unnoticed. Faces turned. Veterans nodded. This wasn't a man demanding attention. He simply couldn't avoid it anymore. Sable returned to the mic. Before we conclude, Lana Merrick, daughter of Master Sergeant Everett, has asked to offer a tribute. Lana rose without hesitation. She moved to the front, unpacked her cello, and took her seat. The room fell silent. She played Adagio for strings, the same piece from the bass, but slower now, wound deeper. It trembled with mourning and pride, with silence and scream. Her bow didn't just make music, it stitched wounds across decades. Thorne closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel everything. The dust, the blood, the betrayal, the loss, the children in the basement, and the woman he loved, who'd handed him a daughter and told him, "Give her a life without shadows." When Lana finished, no one clapped immediately. The silence was reverent. Then applause, measured, real. Jennifer Riley, the widow of Thorne's fallen brother, approached afterward. 10 years I believed a lie, she whispered. Now I can breathe again. Thorne offered no apology, just the truth in his eyes. Weston and Archer joined him by the exit. She's amazing, Weston said, nodding toward Lana. You gave her something pure. She gave it to me, Thorne replied. As they walked toward the elevators, a figure blocked their path. Admiral Blackwood. No uniform, no ribbons, just a man diminished. Congratulations, he said flatly. Enjoy your moment. You gambled with lives, Thorne replied, for your own campaign, and you lost. You defied orders, cost men their lives. No, Thorne said, you did, and now their families know it. Blackwood's lip curled. Think this changes anything? Yes, said a new voice. Commander Sable stepped forward with a folder in hand. You're being called before a review board. Your security clearance is suspended, and the Damascus leak has been traced. You can't prove... We already did. Blackwood paled. He looked around. No allies left. He walked away alone. Hours later, Thorne and Lana stood at the reflecting pool in D.C., watching the sky darken. You okay? She asked. Getting there, he said. That name, she said. Thomas Everett. You wore it well. He smiled faintly. He was never gone, just folded up like an old uniform, she nudged him. You kept the good parts, like being a decent human. And making pancakes on Saturdays. They laughed, then silence again. Would you ever go back? She asked. To that world? No. I've got a boatyard, and a daughter who plays cello like a battle hymn. You're a good dad, she said, even if you used to be a ghost. He looked at her, really looked, and nodded. I'm proud of you, he said, and of your mom. She'd have loved this day. I think she did, Lana whispered. The next morning, they returned to West Haven. The town was quiet, the boatyard untouched. Thorne resumed his work on the Callahan boat, the familiar rhythm grounding him. Lana visited after school, carrying music sheets and stories. Sometimes she played while he worked. Sometimes they said nothing at all. One afternoon, a dusty truck pulled into the lot. A Middle Eastern man stepped out, flanked by 2 grown sons and a daughter. Professor Najjar, Thorne said, eyes widening. You saved my children, the man said. We never forgot. He held out a small box. Inside, another coin. Damascus mint. But this one was engraved with a name. Iron Ghost. You deserve more than shadows, Najjar said. You deserve memory. As they embraced, Lana stood to the side, tears in her eyes. Thorne turned to her, voice thick. I think it's time to tell the whole story. And so he did, not for medals, not for history, but for a daughter, and the men who deserve to be remembered not as casualties of insubordination, but as heroes who stayed.